Hello and welcome. I want to thank FHWA for inviting me to present about the Colorado Department of Transportation's Planning and Environmental Linkages program. My name is Troy Halouska. I am CDOT's PEL Program Manager. My background is in environmental planning, and I've been working on NEPA projects for about 20 years and working with PEL for about 8 of those years. I've been with CDOT for 7 years now in various roles and have worked on PELs during most of that time. I've been the PEL Program Manager for a total of about 3 years. Since this is a recorded presentation, I have included my contact information on the last slide of the presentation. If you would like to contact me, I'm very happy to answer any questions you have about PELs or CDOT's PEL program. So the agenda for today, we are going to talk a little bit about what a PEL is, how CDOT uses PELs, a little bit about our PEL toolkit, the PEL to NEPA transition, and some project examples. I wanted to start off with a video that we created, but I couldn't figure out how to get the video to play automatically during this recording. So instead, I'm just going to share with you the link to CDOT's PEL program page. The video can be found there, and it can also be found by Googling what is a PEL on YouTube. This video helps explain to the public, stakeholders, and those unfamiliar with PEL what PEL is. It's a great little video. It's only 3 minutes long. Definitely watch it when you get a chance. On that same web page, you will also find other PEL tools, including our handbook that we developed and items from the toolkit, which I'll be talking about later. So why do we conduct a PEL study? They are generally conducted before any project construction funding is identified and before specific problems and solutions are known. Due to this, some of the best reasons for conducting a PEL study include building relationships with agencies and stakeholders and to help understand the level of public support for a project or plan. Also, PELs can create a single vision for a corridor, especially if there are multiple jurisdictions with different priorities. PEL studies can help agencies prioritize projects in a way that can be used in future NEPA studies. For example, many PEL studies develop a corridor level purpose and need. They develop and screen alternatives. They identify environmental issues that affects those alternatives. They identify recommended mitigation measures and strategies and inform project limits for individual projects. The primary intent of the PEL concept is to make better planning decisions, especially when resources are limited. This, in turn, helps streamline the NEPA process by reducing duplication of effort and leading to more informed project-level decisions by using information developed during a PEL study. Thus, PEL studies can be used as a bridge between high-level, long-range planning and project-specific NEPA. When should a PEL study be used? They're most helpful when project funding is not yet identified, when problems are not well defined, and solutions to problems are not identified. And advantages of conducting a PEL study under those circumstances is that it is a flexible process that does not have to adhere to the rigors of the NEPA process. It minimizes duplication of effort, including data collection and analysis. You become aware of complex environmental challenges early, and you can avoid those environmentally sensitive natural resources. And you can make better planning decisions with limited resources. It may not save a lot of time and money compared to the traditional NEPA approach initially, although it could, but it definitely leads to better decision making. And where it does save a lot of time, however, is when a PEL spawns several NEPA projects along a corridor. After the initial NEPA project after the PEL, the subsequent NEPA projects tend to go very quick because a lot of rework is being eliminated. A PEL study does not guarantee funding and should not be conducted with the primary purpose of positioning for federal funding. A PEL study does not reduce the level of analysis required for decision-making under NEPA, and PEL studies should not be conducted with the intent of minimizing or shortcutting NEPA requirements or of downgrading a NEPA class of action. However, PEL studies can help streamline the NEPA process, as mentioned, by incorporating relevant analysis and public and agency input, and by identifying where to hone in on and do more focused analysis in NEPA. But not all projects are suited to PEL. A PEL study shouldn't be conducted if you're unsure of the study objective or of federal involvement or authority in NEPA assignment states. Agencies may wish to and are encouraged to conduct good planning studies, but if FHWA is not involved, they don't need to follow the PEL process guidance. Some other types of studies will provide the information needed, such as access plans, a traffic study, or just an existing conditions overview, and a full PEL study is not needed in those cases. If done following 23 CFR 450.212 and .318, those studies can still be used in future NEPA processes even without a PEL study. The timing of NEPA is also a consideration. If a NEPA process is unlikely to begin on any part of the PEL study area within 5 years of the completion of the PEL study, agencies should probably wait to conduct the PEL study or other study. On the flip side, if transportation problems have been identified and construction funding has been committed, a project shouldn't do a PEL study. They should just initiate the NEPA process. So what type of transportation study is appropriate? We have created a little flowchart or decision matrix, as we call it, to help answer that question. In Colorado, CDOT and FHWA Colorado Division came up with this flowchart to help make decisions of whether or not to conduct a PEL study. The intended audience is the CDOT regions, which is where projects and studies are typically executed, and also the local agencies in the state, which sometimes head up PEL studies. We also encourage folks that are thinking about doing a PEL study to have an initial conversation with myself, the PEL Program Manager, or with FHWA's PEL Program Manager here in Colorado. We can often guide them through the nuances of deciding whether or not to do a PEL. If you want to take a closer look, this PEL flowchart is on our website, as I pointed out earlier. So Colorado embraced the PEL concept very early on. We really started conducting PELs in 2008. To date, we have conducted over 30 PEL studies, which have led to about 20 separate NEPA projects. We also created this process flowchart that explains all the steps in a large PEL project. And by no means do all PELs need to follow this flowchart. Some PEL projects can pick and choose different aspects of this flowchart, like identifying stakeholders and then coming up with a purpose and need, and that's it. Again, flexibility is the key in a PEL. However, if you are using this full PEL process that this flowchart lays out, FHWA coordination is a must. Part of what makes a PEL is the involvement with FHWA. The most important coordination points are when the purpose of the PEL study is being determined. Not the purpose and need, but the reason for doing the PEL study. And then again, when the purpose and need is developed, FHWA should be coordinated with. Same thing with the alternatives analysis and with the final PEL document itself. Here in Colorado, FHWA is typically involved in most PEL studies throughout the whole study, especially if CDOT's leading this study. A little less so if a local agency is leading the study. However, the CDOT folks will still coordinate with FHWA at those coordination points no matter what. And here are the 4 coordination points circled. So the FHWA PEL questionnaire, which was developed here in Colorado, is intended to guide the PEL process and provide documentation with the submittal of the PEL. The questionnaire is used at the beginning to help scope a PEL study and is continually used throughout the PEL process to verify steps and study assumptions. FHWA will review the questionnaire at the end of the study. It includes questions related to things like corridor vision and the purpose and need, the range of alternatives and evaluation criteria, agency and public coordination, environmental resources, and the relationship to future NEPA documents. Another aspect of PEL at CDOT that's very important to us is our resource agency coordination and outreach. It's necessary to coordinate with resource agencies and regulatory agencies so that all applicable resource constraints and the severity of those constraints have been recorded. It can be challenging to get the resource and regulatory agencies very involved in a planning study. However, in Colorado, we're lucky. We have the Transportation Environmental Resource Council, or TERC as it is known. It has 15 member agencies, and they have a PEL partnering agreement with CDOT committing to the participation in the PEL approach. That TERC agreement is also on the website. It was signed in 2009. That agreement, or MOU, promotes coordination in the early planning process. If agencies choose not to provide input, the PEL products can still be carried forward into NEPA with the recognition that additional coordination will likely be required during the NEPA phase. CDOT has found that the most effective way to engage agencies is through initial notification and request for input on the existing conditions report. Project teams will typically send a notification letter to agencies letting them know a PEL study is being prepared and asking if they have any questions or comments, and then explaining that an existing conditions report will be sent for their review and comment. Providing this report for review results in better comments and input from the agencies as opposed to having a resource agency scoping meeting, for example, because they have information to respond to. And then at the end, we'll provide a copy of the final PEL document to the agencies as well. The PEL study should identify key resources and resources with lengthy environmental clearance processes that may be affected. The FHWA PEL questionnaire, in particular questions 9 and 10 on that questionnaire, provide guidance on identifying environmental resources in the PEL. PELs will provide context to the environmental resources, often through an environmental overview, similar to the affected environment in a NEPA document, but a much lower level of detail. At the PEL level, it's also possible to identify potential changes to alternatives based on environmental impacts before heading into NEPA. Again, these are very high-level looks at these impacts, and it's mostly just red flags. The PEL study can also recommend mitigation strategies for anticipated impacts. So our CDOT PEL Handbook was initially created in 2012. It's our primary reference for conducting PEL studies. It provides guidance and best practices, but it's not regulatory or mandatory to use. It was updated in 2015 and incorporated lessons learned and current best practices and new legislative requirements. It is a living document and it is continually updated with current practices. Our next update will be complete hopefully before the end of the year. We've also developed a PEL training course. This day-long course consists of 5 training modules that correspond with the material in the PEL handbook. These are an overview of the PEL process, a review of the PEL process guidance, how to conduct a PEL study, the PEL process and long-range planning, and then transitioning a PEL study to NEPA. The intended audience is CDOT and FHWA PEL practitioners, as well as local agencies that conduct PELs. At times we have opened up the training to our consultant community, and several times we have also had other state DOTs participate and other FHWA divisions attend. So where do we see benefits from the PEL process? There are 3 broad categories. We see benefits to stakeholders, we see benefits to the environment, and we see benefits to the NEPA documentation process. For stakeholders, the PEL process allows the transportation agencies to identify them early in the planning process. PEL studies also provide a framework for agencies to identify and solve transportation problems across jurisdictions. Stakeholder participation provides input, much needed input on planning activities, helps CDOT gauge public support of the project or plan, and ultimately builds stronger relationships with the agencies and the public that then continue on through the project development phase and into construction. Early and ongoing agency coordination may help focus on environmental issues of concern and lead to developing programmatic agreements with the resource agencies if necessary. For the environment, environmental stewardship is encouraged by the PEL process by early integration of environmental analysis. While detailed impacts should not be determined at this point, again, red flags should be noted and high-level mitigation developed. And then for documentation, each step of the PEL process has benefits in NEPA. The purpose and need can be outlined during the PEL process, helping to determine project needs and saving time during NEPA. Assessing potential high-level environmental impacts during PEL can help develop better preliminary alternatives. It can help identify resources needing more detailed analysis under NEPA and develop potential mitigation strategies, saving time during the NEPA process and helping NEPA studies be more focused. The PEL study will help identify and prioritize individual projects in order to break the project into logical phases if needed. We have developed what we're calling a toolkit for PEL, and it helps our PEL process and those practitioners of PELs. Some of these items that have been completed and are in use include the handbook, as mentioned, that YouTube video, the PEL training course, and that decision matrix mentioned. We have also updated the PEL questionnaire recently to focus a little more on the PEL to NEPA transition. And the FHWA Colorado division has created a standard operating procedure to guide its area engineers through the PEL process. And I'll go into a little more detail about those that we are still developing. One is the environmental scoping form. We developed a scoping form for environmental staff in the department to use when scoping a project. This form is currently the same between NEPA scoping and PEL to help keep the resources consistent and help better define the level of analysis that each resource needs for PEL and for NEPA. We're also working on adding other fields, and one in particular is the amount of traffic modeling needed. Another thing in development is an existing conditions template. It can be hard for project teams to stay at the right level of detail. PEL is not NEPA. We are developing an existing conditions template to guide these teams with the appropriate level of detail. As alluded to, the goal of a PEL is to help define the potential constraints and resources of concern, which help identify what will need to be focused on during NEPA, but not to do a deep dive into the resources. Most of the time, data used is readily available desktop data, and sometimes a windshield survey is conducted, but that's about it. On this slide is an example from our State Highway 66 PEL study, which I will talk about here shortly. So this graphic illustrates a tool we're building to use during the alternative screening process. It shows 3 levels of screening, a purpose and needs screening, a comparative screening, and detailed evaluation screening. All levels of screening are not appropriate for all PELs. As mentioned, the PEL process is extremely flexible, and a team might decide that they only want to screen against the purpose and need and leave it at that. The rest of the screening can then be picked up during NEPA. In fact, we've had a few instances of lessons learned when it comes to screening too far. There have been times when we would get down to 1 or 2 alternatives left on the table, and then NEPA didn't happen for a while. Then once the NEPA phase began, some players and politics had changed, some technology had changed, and we ended up going back and reanalyzing alternatives that were eliminated or not recommended as part of the PEL. Now, if construction funding is imminent, it might be worth the effort to do detailed screening. Otherwise, it's best to have several viable alternatives left on the table. Through the screening process, alternatives will fall into one of 4 categories after screening. After a level 1 screening, for instance, against the purpose and need, an alternative will either be carried forward for further evaluation or it will be eliminated. And that is generally the only time we eliminate alternatives, is if they aren't going to meet the purpose and need, or if there's some sort of really high impact that alternative would have. And then beyond that, we either recommend or not recommend alternatives. By the end of the PEL study, you should have several recommended alternatives that can be carried forward into NEPA. One of the main goals for doing a PEL study is to eventually transition into NEPA and help streamline that process. If done correctly, the PEL information can be incorporated into the NEPA document by reference or as an appendix. So for the PEL to NEPA transition, there are several aspects that I'm going to talk about. One is scoping. Beginning the NEPA process with a PEL would definitely help the scoping process. You will know more about the project goals, needs, and surrounding environment. What can be directly used in NEPA versus just informing the process depends on the particulars of the PEL study. In determining what information from the PEL study can be used for the NEPA steps, such as scoping or alternatives or stakeholder involvement, you should review the PEL study for unresolved or critical issues, who participated in the study, including stakeholders and agencies. You look for important environmental constraints, and then you look at what the alternative screening process was and the recommendations from that process. Also, review of the PEL questionnaire, which specifically discusses how PEL will be incorporated into the NEPA document, is highly recommended. If your PEL study is more than 5 years old, you will need to review its applicability. FHWA should be involved in that review. For the environmental evaluation, the PEL study provides a head start to the NEPA process by identifying important environmental constraints, by identifying the resources that do not require detailed analysis, by providing recommendations for the methods and schedule for additional analysis that will be required during NEPA, and identifying potential mitigation strategies. Data from a PEL study can be used directly in NEPA if it is not more than 5 years old, as I just mentioned, or if older than 5 years, it needs to be revisited and updated during NEPA. And then also, as discussed previously, unlike under NEPA, agency involvement in a PEL study is voluntary. However, it is highly desired. When transitioning, make sure the team understands that the PEL questionnaire will provide the information about what agencies were involved, the issues that were raised by the agencies, steps that should be taken with agencies during NEPA, and agency input on methodologies and mitigation strategies. From our experience, as agencies become more familiar with the PEL process, they do find value in participating. So CDOT's NEPA program and the PEL program work closely together. Both program managers are often involved with study teams throughout the process to provide guidance and assistance. We do believe that PEL does indeed lead to better decision making. We also believe that PELs save time and money over expensive and time-consuming Tier 1 EIS level documents. That is not to say that CDOT wouldn't undertake an EIS if the impacts warranted such a document, but PEL provides information and early analysis and decision making that has, in part, precluded us from starting any new EIS in the last 15 years. So quickly, a couple project examples I wanted to talk about. One is the US 50 West project. This was one of our very first PELs in CDOT that was completed. It was a study that analyzed the US 50 West corridor in Pueblo, which was a 12-mile corridor. Some of the issues were peak hour congestion and crashes resulting from that congestion. The PEL was able to bring the local community, city leaders, CDOT, and FHWA together to develop a vision for the corridor that help understand what some of those issues were and the resources that were in the corridor. As of today, the PEL has spun off 2 environmental assessments for capacity projects that took only 4 months to complete. It also spurred 2 programmatic CADEX projects for improvements to the highway facility. The corridor is about 75% built out as envisioned by the PEL's implementation plan. This project is a great example of how the momentum from a PEL can lead to funding and construction of parts of the PEL implementation plan. A more recent project, the I-25 South PEL, is a study along 34 miles of I-25 in Douglas County. The project started with political pressure to add improvements to a very heavily traveled 4-lane section of I-25. The PEL started and was used as a crucial piece of information in receiving a federal infra grant of $65 million for Early Action NEPA project. And this Early Action NEPA project happened in the southernmost 18 miles of the corridor. The project was the addition of tolled express lanes along with substantial infrastructure improvements. And the stakeholders in the area were key in securing the funding and highlighting issues like vehicle-wildlife collisions that led to the inclusion of 4 wildlife underpasses as part of that project. This PEL was unique in the fact that it paused while the NEPA portion was completed. When it resumed, the NEPA portion was considered an existing condition. This project does highlight though, what PEL can do in terms of funding and head starting NEPA. The coalition behind the project was able to work the local and federal connections to fully fund the project. And then State Highway 66, I mentioned earlier. Again, it's hard for project teams to stay at the right level of detail and remember that PEL is not NEPA. This study, just completed, was a 20-mile corridor that crossed multiple jurisdictions. It was conducted to identify existing conditions, anticipated challenge areas, safety issues, and operational needs along this section of State Highway 66 to determine its short-term and long-term transportation priorities. Not only did it do a great job of consensus building, but it really is a great example of the level of detail that probably should be done for a PEL of this type. All 3 of these projects are on our website, and I encourage you to check them out. So CDOT has compiled a list of best practices from recent PEL studies in Colorado, and these are listed in Table 7.1 of the current handbook. This table was updated as part of the handbook update in 2015, and project teams were interviewed. Their input is presented in that table. All the studies identified stakeholder coordination as a best practice. Successful studies coordinated with multiple stakeholders, particularly local governments and other public agencies. Best practices for technical analysis often related to traffic modeling approaches and environmental surveys. And then best practices for identifying recommendations centered around consensus building. Other DOTs have PEL programs. In fact, about half the states are conducting PEL studies, and I understand 13 of those states are using the PEL Questionnaire. Several states, including California, are starting their very first PEL, which is exciting. Again, it is flexible, and the states can use the process in a multitude of ways. A lot just use it to determine whether or not to even do a project. But it is great to see the PEL concept catching on all across the country. Thank you very much for having me. Here is my contact information and also the contact information for FHWA's Colorado Division PEL Program Manager. She or I are very available and willing to answer questions or concerns or talk about PEL in general. We both love PELs, and we do see the value they serve in the project development process. Again, thank you for having me.